Hello, this is Bob Pierce, Tobacco and Hemp Specialist in the Plant and Soil Sciences Department at the University of Kentucky. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about hemp variety or cultivar selection. The terms variety and cultivar are often used interchangeably, and cultivar is just a very specific term for a variety that was developed for cultivation or use in growing of crops. So you'll hear me use those terms interchangeably throughout this presentation. Arguably, the selection of a variety or a cultivar is one of the most important decisions that a producer of any crop can make. Unfortunately for hemp growers, there's not a lot of information to go by on many of the varieties and the cultivars that are available. Many of the varieties that we're currently using were developed in other countries, and some have unknown histories. Many of them have come out of the cannabis industry, and they've been passed around so much that their background has been lost somewhat in the shuffle. And so there's not a lot known about some of these varieties and cultivars that are out there. At the same time, the people who have developed a lot of these varieties are protecting their interest in those, and so the varieties are privately held. And you might be asked when you purchase a variety or purchase some seed to grow something, you might be asked to sign a material transfer agreement, which basically says that you're going to respect their rights to that variety and not use it for any purposes of developing new varieties or any kind of breeding work. The public breeding programs or university programs are just barely getting started now into the hemp business. And those programs were very important, especially in the early days for some of the other major crops like corn and soybean and wheat, in developing genetics that would eventually be used to develop grower varieties and cultivars. So, for example, they have established germplasm banks that may have different disease resistances or other characteristics that might be desired in a crop variety. There is no such thing for hemp. There was one many years ago, but that was destroyed. All of the cultivars or varieties that were in there were destroyed, and so there's no established germplasm bank currently. Although some people are beginning to look at wild sources of hemp, or ditchweed as they might call it, as populations of genetic variability. The bottom line, though, for the variety and cultivar development is that it's going to take some time to develop locally adapted varieties, varieties that have the right photoperiod for the day lengths that we have in this area. If we're talking about grain, reducing the seed shatter problem that we see in grain production, and just basically optimizing the properties of that variety for either fiber, grain, or CBD production, whichever we're most interested in. And perhaps one of the most important, especially as we see the implementation of the interim final rule under the 2018 Farm Bill, we're going to have cultivars that can consistently be compliant with the THC restrictions so that we're legally able to sell those crops. So where can you find information about cultivar or variety performance? For grain and fiber trials, we've done a few trials at the University of Kentucky. You can see some pictures here on this side of the slide. This is our 2019 fiber variety trial. We only had 4 hemp varieties in there and a couple of canaf varieties, so it's not a very large trial, and the information is somewhat limited. We also have variety trials from previous seasons as well, 2017 and 2018, on our website. And the same for grain trials as well. We did participate in a nationwide grain trial in 2019, and I'll show you some more information from that shortly. So there is a bit of information on those types of varieties and cultivars. If you're interested in producing cannabinoids or flowers, there's very limited information available on cannabinoid cultivars. There have been some trials at Cornell University in New York and at North Carolina State University that I'm aware of. There may be a few others, mostly in the western states, but for the eastern U.S., those are the trials that I know about on cannabinoid testing, and I'll show you a bit of data from the NC State trial. Another source of information for varieties of cultivars of all types, grain, fiber, or cannabinoid, is the Kentucky Department of Agriculture Summary of Varieties list. This list does not have field performance data in it in terms of the yields that you might expect of dry matter, but it does have information that identifies the variety's potential to result in non-compliant THC levels, and I've included a link on this slide to that page, or you can go to the KDA Hemp webpage and find that information as well. So while it doesn't have performance data, it is good for looking at THC compliance, and we'll take a closer look at that in a few moments. You can also get information about a cultivar variety from the owner or the processor who wants to sell you the seed or the plants of that particular variety. But you have to realize that, obviously they have something to gain by that, and they may show you a point in time measurement of for example, the CBD and the THC levels of that. And so you have to be aware that those things may change over time, and they may be different in different locations. And we'll talk about some of the data that has been collected in Kentucky on some of these cultivars. So I thought I'd show you a little bit on fiber cultivar selection. Again, we don't have a tremendous amount of data on this yet. We haven't been able to test a large number of varieties, and most of these have come from other places in the world. So we've got several cultivars listed here. You can see some have come from China, a couple from Italy, and one from Poland. One of these cultivars that we were growing in 2017 and 2018 was determined to produce unacceptably high levels of THC too often, and so has been prohibited in 2020 from being grown in Kentucky. But the other thing that I'll point out about this too, out of all of these locations and cultivars that we tried, there was only 2 cultivars, one of which is now the prohibited one, at one location in 1 year that produced anywhere close to what we feel like is going to be necessary for an economically viable yield of straw for fiber production. So we still have a long ways to go to get the production system nailed down and determine cultivars that are going to meet the needs of a future fiber industry. We are continuing to work on that, and on 2019 data, we've started to look at some fiber quality aspects as well, and we will continue to expand that data. As I mentioned, we also participated in a national grain cultivar trial. So we had actually 10 locations that started. Some of them we didn't get the data back from yet, and some of them they didn't get good stands of the materials. But we were able to get from 4 locations that we're showing here: Kentucky, New York, North Dakota, and Kansas. Yields of some grain varieties, and again, you can see all of these come from different places in the world. Some from Canada, Italy, Ukraine were the main ones that were represented here. And you'll see that there are certain cultivars, like the Canadian cultivars, seem to do fairly well across a wide range of locations, including here in Kentucky. Some of the ones from Italy didn't maybe do as well here, but did okay in some other locations. The Ukrainian ones did well in one location and maybe not as well in some other locations. So there was some variability in how they adapted to different types of conditions. And we've got a lot more to learn about that as well. But right now we do feel like we've got some that we can say are fairly consistent, others maybe not so much. And we need to understand what characteristics of those we need so we can apply that to future selections of. If you're going to be growing hemp in Kentucky, whether it's for fiber or grain or flowers or cannabinoids, you need to check this list on the Kentucky Department of Agriculture website before you ever order any plants or seeds for whatever you're growing. The cultivar must be on this list in order to be grown in Kentucky. And there are over 250 cultivars that have been listed, but there are some that have been prohibited because they have been shown to consistently test above the limits for THC and have a tendency to be non-compliant. So those are cultivars that have already been prohibited based on previous years of testing. If a cultivar is not on this list and you would like to grow it, then you will need to go on the Kentucky Department of Agriculture website and get their variety request form and fill in some information about that variety. You will have to get a test result from the producer of that variety that shows that it is likely to be compliant for THC levels, and send that to the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. There's instructions on their website for how to do this, and make sure that that variety gets listed. It will go on the list as a new variety, indicating that we do not have test results from it within Kentucky, but then it will be able to be grown, assuming that it's approved based on the documentation that you submit. In addition to varieties that have been prohibited, there are a number of varieties on the list that are designated as varieties of concern. They're designated in this way because they have been shown to have some risk of producing a non-compliant THC level, and so we need to be careful or cautious with those when we're growing those varieties of concern. And so this is an example of what the list looks like. This is an example of what the list looks like, and you can see the names of the varieties in this column, whether it's a variety of concern or prohibited variety in this column, the type of hemp that it's intended for mostly, and there's some that cross over and can do multiple products, but these are what they have been designated as by the people who have entered them into the list, whether it's a floral variety or grain or fiber type for the most part. The country of origin, and then there are THC test results here indicating how many times it has tested below 0.3, between 0.3 and 0.4, and how many times it has tested above 0.4. And one of the things that we find on here, you see that a lot of these varieties are listed as varieties of concern, because almost any variety that has claimed to produce a high level of CBD can have a tendency to produce non-compliant THC results as well. So variety of concern indicates that it has had at least one test that has exceeded 0.3% THC at some point in the testing program. And in 2019, and these are results from these cultivars being grown on Kentucky farms by Kentucky growers, over 40% of all the tests that were conducted were above 0.3% THC, and 17% were above the 0.4% THC limits that have been established. So it definitely is a concern that you need to be aware of if you're growing in this state. So what I've done now is taken some of the data from that data set that the KDA has, and also added some CBD information into it as well. And we're going to look at some different categories of hemp cultivars. So these are ones that are currently prohibited in Kentucky, and some of these were grown fairly widely in 2019 but will not be available to grow, like the Suver Haze. The cherry variety was quite popular, but when we look at the data that has come out of actual testing in Kentucky on these, in this column we've got the average THC, then we have average CBD, the THC to CBD ratio, the maxes of THC and CBD, and the total number of tests that were conducted. And then the last column shows the percentage of the time that in our testing that the cultivar exceeded 0.3% THC. So in this group of prohibited varieties, and this is not all of the prohibited varieties, just some examples, but in this group of prohibited varieties, it's pretty easy to see why, because they all average above 0.3% THC. Now they do have good CBD numbers in the 8 to 9 range, with maximums, going up into the middle teens for maximum percentages of CBD. But the percentage of times that they go over THC is in above 50% of the time they will produce a non-compliant THC result, which is just too risky to continue to use these varieties or cultivars. The other thing that I want to point out is you can see the range of CBD to THC is from about 20 to say 25 or so in terms of a ratio, and that will be a point to look at as we look at some of these other categories of cultivars. So this next group is what I would consider to be high-risk cultivars, or examples of high-risk cultivars, and there's some fairly common ones on here, popular ones if you will. The CBD RX by Cherry was grown quite widely, Cherry Wine, Lifter, T1 or Trump. So these are some cultivars that are grown fairly widely. For the most part, most of these are right around that 0.3% THC level in terms of an average, but you'll notice compared to the last group, the average CBD is also a little bit lower. Interestingly, for the most part, the CBD to THC ratio of most of these is pretty much in the same range. We got a couple of outliers, but mostly from 20 to 25 ratio of CBD to THC. They can still produce some good CBD levels, but typically if they're those that are producing the higher CBD are also producing higher THC, as these tend to go hand in hand in these plants. And still roughly 30 to 40% of the time will produce a THC level exceeding 0.3%. The next category I would call maybe moderate risk cultivars in terms of growing, and some popular ones here include the Bayox or the box variety, sweetened variety, Auto 2, some of the names that you may have heard. In this group, you can see the average THC is a little bit lower, around 0.2 to up to 0.3%, but in this case, they're all on average below the 0.3. Notice though that the average CBD compared to the last category is also coming down a little bit, but the CBD to THC ratio stays pretty much the same. And somewhere around 20 to 25%, some cases maybe a little bit higher, but 20 to 25% of the time still have the possibility of exceeding the 0.3 THC limit. And so that's why I say these are not no risk, but moderate risk cultivars. And then the last category I'll show some examples of is the low risk cultivars. These are showing relatively low THC averages compared to some of the other ones that we've looked at, but also relatively low CBD averages. And certainly in the way the current market is going, these would probably not be economically viable in terms of the amount of CBD that is being produced. So even though they're low risk for THC, they may not be as useful for producing CBD as some other types. But you'll notice CBD, some of these in fact have some of the highest CBD to THC ratios, or they tend to be on that upper end of around 25% CBD to THC. Relatively low risk, less than 10% for most of them, of having a non-compliant THC result. Now, it's not just our testing in Kentucky or our data in Kentucky that's showing that a lot of these cultivars have a tendency to exceed the limit for THC. So this is some data from the North Carolina hemp trials. You can see they had some of the same cultivars that we were just talking about, the Bayox, the Suver Haze, Cherry Wine, T1. Several of these different ones are on here. Now they do have some yield data. So looking at floral, and they've got them arranged from the highest to the lowest yield in terms of floral component yield. You can also see the whole plant matter compared to that and the amount of floral material that came out of that. And it would be very tempting to look at some of these and say, oh, here's the Delta 9 THC. They are all below 0.3. But we cannot consider just the delta-9 THC. We have to consider the total THC, which adds the delta-9 and the THCA together. And when you do that, and you look, these were 3 different locations where they were testing at. You can see in just about all of these locations, there are only 1 or 2 cultivars out of all of them that come close to compliance. Now, in the case of this trial, they let everything go to what we might call full maturity, and so the maximum expression of THC and CBD. But when you do that, there's a very high likelihood of exceeding the THC limit, and the crop may not be marked at that stage. So the factors you need to consider and think about for THC compliance, and as you're choosing varieties, Cultivar has the greatest influence on potential THC level. It's in the genetics of the cultivars as to how much cannabinoids they're going to produce and potentially which ones have the potential to produce high THC levels. So theoretically, we want to look for cultivars with a high CBD to THC ratio, but from what we've seen in most of our testing, that ratio is pretty tight within that 20 to 25, maybe up to 30 to 1 kind of ratio from CBD to THC. So there's not a lot of room to play with in there, and we don't know how conditions like weather conditions or fertility may change those ratios. We just don't have a lot of good information on that yet within a particular cultivar or variety. So what we tend to see, so like all of these individuals here are kind of lining up along that line of 25 to 30 to 1 THC to CBD. The tests that come up in this range are typically kind of outliers, and that comes to the variability that occurs within these cultivars where they're not that stable. Again, we don't know the full effects of stress and how that might affect the total or the ratio of the cannabinoids or the effect that fertility may have. So this is some data, and this looks, if you look at the distribution of points on here, very similar to the last chart that I showed, but this is some data that's coming from Cornell at New York, and they actually have gone in and identified the genetics of these. And so these individuals with the red dots are known to have the genes for producing THC. And genes are paired up, and so it has the THC genes in both locations. The ones in greens are what we might call hybrids, has 1 THC gene, 1 CBD gene, so they tend to produce a moderate amount of THC. And then the ones here in the blue along this line have the CBD gene. But even if they have 2 copies of the CBD gene, there's always a little bit of THC being produced in all of these, and that's what leads to that ratio, that 20 to 25 ratio typically of those cultivars. So theoretically, if we're looking at a 25 to 1 ratio, when we get to a CBD level of 6%, we're going to be pretty close to 0.3% THC, and that's within all the genetics. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a variety out there that may do better than that and be able to produce a higher CBD without producing or without a risk of producing a high THC. But for most of the cultivars that we know that are out there, they're on this line. And so as we increase CBD levels, we're increasing the chance of having a non-compliant test. Now, time is another factor in determining this as well. I mentioned in the North Carolina study, they let those go to maturity. Theoretically, you can test for the THC levels and try to harvest before, or have your harvest test and harvest before the THC exceeds 0.3. Unfortunately, the cannabinoid levels don't increase in a predictable linear way. They have a tendency, they may go along slowly and then jump up at some point, so it is a bit of a risk to do that, but that is one way of managing the system. is testing and knowing what your THC levels are, and as you approach that 0.3%, go ahead and schedule the harvest before it exceeds it and the material becomes non-compliant. So my number one take-home message or lesson for selecting a hemp cultivar in Kentucky is to check the KDA variety list and absolutely consider THC compliance, because you do not want to be in a position where you have spent your time and your money producing a crop that is not marketable because it doesn't meet THC compliance levels. I hope this is helpful as you plan for your hemp production in 2020. If you have any questions, certainly feel free to contact us or go to the hemp website that's listed here. There's a series of other videos that will go over other parts of the production system.